They tied the little Choctaw girl to a fence for punishment, until the Comanche gunslinger gave her a home. The sun beat down on the parched earth, turning the air into a shimmering mirage, but no trick of light could obscure the stark brutality of the scene. A small figure, no more than 8 years old, was lashed tightly to a split-rail fence, her small frame slumped, head bowed against the rough wood. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, was now dust-caked and torn, clinging to her fragile limbs. This was Ilara, a girl of the Choctaw, left to bake under the unforgiving gaze of an indifferent sky. Her silent suffering seemed to hum in the oppressive heat, a discordant note in the otherwise tranquil, sun-drenched landscape. It was a tableau of deliberate cruelty, designed not merely to inflict pain, but to erase a spirit. The distant clucking of chickens and the lowing of cattle from the nearby farmhouse served only to amplify the chilling silence that clung to the girl. Was this a lesson? A warning? Or simply the casual exercise of power by those who believed themselves entitled to it, over any living thing that did not resemble them? The air tasted of dust and despair, a bitter concoction that settled deep in the throat. No tears traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. Perhaps there were none left to shed, or perhaps defiance, however small, had solidified within her. The world had shown her its teeth early, sharp and unforgiving, promising only more of the same. She was a trespasser in their eyes, an inconvenience, a wild seed stubbornly refusing to be uprooted. The faint scent of wood smoke mingled with the acrid tang of fear, a primal warning that permeated the very fabric of the desolate afternoon. What cruel calculus had led to this moment? What twisted sense of justice had deemed this punishment fitting for a child? The answers, unvoiced, hung heavy in the stifling air. Unspoken accusations against a world that had so readily abandoned its most vulnerable. She was a silent testament to the fragile boundaries of humanity, and the ease with which they could be shattered. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Then, a shadow detached itself from the horizon, riding on a whisper of wind. A horseman, a silhouette against the blinding sun, his approach marked only by the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard earth. He was Kyle, a man shaped by the vast, indifferent plains, his skin leathered by sun and wind, his eyes holding the haunted depth of distant storms. A Comanche, they called him, though his lineage was a tangled braid of forgotten trails and whispered allegiances. He saw the girl, a small, dark blot against the bleached fence, and something shifted within him, a tremor in the foundations of his carefully constructed indifference. He reined his horse, a powerful roan, to a halt, the creak of the saddle the loudest sound in the suddenly hushed afternoon. His gaze swept over the farmhouse, a low, squat structure with smoke curling lazily from its chimney, then settled on the girl. A flicker of something primal ignited in his dark eyes. Not pity, perhaps, but a cold, hard recognition of injustice. He dismounted with an economy of motion, his long coat swaying, revealing the worn holster and the glint of steel. The very air around him seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension, the kind that precedes a storm. From the porch of the farmhouse, a burly man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, emerged, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. His wife, a stern-faced woman with tightly drawn hair, peered over his shoulder. Their faces were etched with a peculiar blend of entitlement and suspicion, a defensive posture common to those who felt their petty kingdom was being trespassed upon. "What do you want, stranger?" the man growled, his voice laced with the casual arrogance of assumed authority. Cale said nothing, his eyes fixed on Ilara, then on the ropes biting into her wrists. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, filled only with the buzzing of flies and the rapid pulse of unspoken threats. What did he want? The question hung, unanswered, in the hot, still air, promising a confrontation that had been brewing for centuries on this stolen land. His presence was a stark challenge, a dark omen to their placid, self-satisfied cruelty. Cale's silence was a weapon, sharp and precise. He took a single, deliberate step towards the fence, his gaze never leaving the bound girl. The farm owner, sensing the shift in the air, the cold certainty emanating from the stranger, squared his shoulders, a performative display of bravado. "She's a thieving savage," he spat, the words a worn justification, a lazy cruelty. Needs to learn her place. Kyle's eyes, dark and fathomless, finally lifted to meet the man's, and in their depths, something ancient and dangerous stirred. There was no rage, no fire, only a terrible, quiet understanding. He merely reached for the ropes, his movements fluid, unhurried. The farmer started forward, a shout forming in his throat, but Cale's hand, quick as a striking viper, rested on the hilt of his revolver. The metallic whisper was barely audible, yet it resonated like a thunderclap in the oppressive stillness. The farmer froze, his face paling, the bravado draining from him like water from a sieve. His wife whimpered, pulling back into the shadows of the doorway. The little Choctaw girl, Ilara, stirred, her eyes fluttering open, wide and unblinking, reflecting the towering figure that now stood over her, a dark silhouette against the fiery sun. There was no recognition in her gaze, only a deep, weary resignation. Cale cut the ropes with a hunting knife, the sharp blade tearing through the rough fibers with ease. He didn't speak, not a single word, as he knelt and gently lifted the girl, her weight disturbingly light in his arms. He felt the tremor in her small body, the lingering fear, but also a quiet resolve. He carried her to his horse, a silent procession of two souls bound by an unforeseen moment of intervention. The farmer and his wife watched, dumbfounded and powerless, as Kyle swung himself into the saddle, Ilara held securely before him. The only sound was the jingle of the harness as he turned the horse, slowly, deliberately, and rode away, leaving behind the dust and the stunned silence of their petty tyranny. The horizon swallowed them whole, leaving a lingering question in the minds of those left behind. Who was this man? And what darkness did he carry that allowed him to move with such terrifying, quiet authority? The journey west was a blur of sun-scorched plains and endless, indifferent sky. Kyle rode silently, Ilara a small, still presence before him. She rarely spoke, her words few and whispered, like the rustle of dry leaves. He offered water, hardtack, and jerky, which she accepted with a quiet solemnity that was both unnerving and deeply moving. He had seen fear in children, defiance too, but her stillness was something else entirely, a profound, ancient weariness that belied her tender years. What had she endured before that fence? What terrors had etched such deep resignation into her small heart? He found himself watching her, a strange, unbidden curiosity stirring within his guarded core. His own past, a landscape of betrayal and violence, had taught him to trust no one, to feel nothing. Yet this girl, this fragile echo of a stolen heritage, was chipping away at the rigid walls he had built around himself. He remembered a cold night years ago, the scent of burning wood and the screams that still haunted his sleep. A raid, swift and brutal, had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a thirst for a justice he knew he'd never find. He had become a ghost in his own land, moving between worlds, never truly belonging to either. This girl reminded him, in a way he couldn't articulate, of a past he desperately tried to bury, and a future he never imagined. He chose campsites with a hunter's precision, nestled amongst rocks or in the shelter of a dry creek bed, always mindful of the wind, the tracks, the unseen eyes that might watch from the vast emptiness. He would make a small fire, just enough to warm the chill from the night air, and they would sit in silence, the crackling flames the only sound. Ilara would sometimes hum a soft, tuneless melody, a quiet echo of a lullaby, perhaps, and in those moments Cale felt a fleeting, almost forgotten sensation, a warmth, fragile as a spider's web, stretching across the desolate expanse of his own soul. He had brought her from one harsh reality into another, but this one, at least, was of his own making, and held a faint promise of safety, however tenuous. They found their home in a high, secluded valley, a hidden alcove nestled deep within the foothills, a place forgotten by maps and untouched by the relentless push of civilization. It was a rugged sanctuary, scarred by ancient winds, yet offering a surprising bounty of spring water and hardy game. Here, under the vast, indifferent gaze of the western sky, a fragile rhythm began to form. Kyle built a lean-to against a weathered rock face, then a more substantial wickiup, weaving branches and hides with practiced hands. He taught Ilara to track rabbits, to identify edible plants, to read the language of the wind and the whisper of the distant thunder. She, in turn, showed him a quiet resilience, an intuitive understanding of the wild that surprised him. She spoke more now, her voice still soft, but gaining a nascent strength. Her questions were simple, direct, cutting through his layers of hardened silence. "Why do you watch the stars so long, Kyle?" Or, "What makes the river sing?" He found himself answering, hesitant at first, then with a gruff tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He told her stories of the constellations, of ancient trails, of the silent wisdom of the land. He never spoke of his past, not directly, but sometimes a shadow would cross his eyes, a distant echo of a forgotten battle, a memory of smoke and betrayal that still clung to the edges of his consciousness. He was a deeply flawed man, his hands stained by necessity and survival, his heart a fortress built against pain. Yet with Alara, a tiny crack had appeared in that formidable wall, allowing a sliver of light, of something akin to warmth, to seep through. He found himself protecting her not just from external threats, but from the echoes of his own bitter history, from the dark currents that still ran beneath his surface. The world outside remained a distant, dangerous rumble, a constant reminder of the fragile peace they had forged. He knew it could not last, not truly. The ghosts of his past, and the relentless expansion of those who sought to claim every last corner of this wild land, would inevitably come calling. He sensed it, a tightening in his gut, a subtle shift in the wind that spoke of approaching storm. The storm arrived not as a sudden downpour, but as a slow, creeping dread. Riders, not just a handful, but a small detachment, their dust trail visible for miles, snaking across the plains like a venomous serpent. Kyle recognized the determined posture, the glint of uniform brass in the distance. They were soldiers, undoubtedly dispatched from a fort far to the east, perhaps tracking him, perhaps simply scouring the land for any native presence they could eradicate. A cold knot tightened in Cale's stomach. He had outrun them before, outsmarted them countless times, but now he had Alara. Her innocent presence was a vulnerability he had never known, a heavy weight that anchored him even as his instincts screamed for flight. He watched them through his spyglass, his expression grim, every muscle in his body tense. There was a scar above his left eye, a jagged white line that pulsed faintly with old pain, a reminder of the last time he'd underestimated the reach of these men. A flashback, sharp and vivid, pierced his thoughts. The burning huts, the terrified faces of his people, the relentless pursuit that had splintered his family, leaving him a lone wolf. He had sworn then, in the ashes of his world, that he would never again be caught vulnerable, never again lose what little he had. Now, looking at Alara, quietly drawing figures in the dirt with a stick, utterly oblivious to the approaching danger, he knew that oath would be tested. He thought of the farm owner, the man who had tied her to the fence. He hadn't bothered to kill him, a mercy born of indifference, but now, a flicker of dark irony twisted his lips. Those same forces of order and progress were now seeking to disrupt the fragile peace he had built for this child. He knew their methods, their callous disregard for anything not white or Christian. They would see Alara not as a child, but as an Indian, and him as a dangerous renegade. The only difference between them and the farmer was the uniform. The core of their cruelty, he knew, was precisely the same. He began to gather their meager belongings, his movements deliberate, methodical. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting was upon them, whether he wanted it or not. Cale explained it simply to Alara, without embellishment, only the stark truth. "We must leave, little one, quickly." Her small hand instinctively sought his, her eyes wide with a fear he recognized, a fear that mirrored his own, deep and buried. He led her through a labyrinth of narrow canyons, a path known only to a few, a desperate gamble against the encroaching soldiers. The pursuit was relentless, a relentless drumbeat of hooves echoing through the confined spaces. They were hunters, tenacious and cruel, fueled by a self-righteous conviction that their cause was just. Kyle moved with the predatory grace of a cornered animal, his senses heightened, every shadow a potential ambush. He set diversions, used the terrain to his advantage, but their numbers were too great, their determination too unyielding. The sound of gunshots, distant at first, grew steadily closer, shattering the fragile silence of the wilderness. He pushed Alara ahead of him, urging her to move faster, her small legs burning with exhaustion. He knew this would come, this confrontation. His entire life had been a series of narrow escapes, a dance with the Reaper, but now the stakes were impossibly high. He remembered the last time he had faced such overwhelming odds, a desperate stand against men who saw him as less than human. The memory was a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder of wounds that had never truly healed. He had lost so much then. He would not lose her. Not this one. He saw a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a person, leading upwards. "Go, Ilara! Climb!" he commanded, his voice raw with urgency. She hesitated, her eyes filled with terror. But then, seeing the grim resolve on his face, the desperation in his gaze, she scrambled into the opening. Cale turned, drawing his revolver, the familiar weight of the steel a cold comfort in his hand. The soldiers emerged into the clearing, their faces grim, their rifles leveled. A sergeant, his eyes hard and unforgiving, bellowed, "Surrender, Indian, or we'll cut you down!" Kyle met his gaze, his face a mask of stone, his finger tightening on the trigger. The air vibrated with a terrible, inevitable tension. This was his last stand, a final, desperate act of defiance against a world that had always sought to crush him, and now threatened to take the only thing he had left. The first shot cracked, echoing off the canyon walls, followed by a volley that tore through the air, splinters erupting from the rock face behind Cale. He moved, a blur of motion, firing with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. The soldiers, surprised by his ferocity, scattered, but regrouped quickly, their training overcoming their initial shock. Bullets whizzed past, tearing at his coat, grazing his arm. He felt a sharp, burning pain but ignored it, his focus absolute, his mind a single, unwavering point of fury. He was no hero. He was merely a man fighting for the last sliver of something he had salvaged from the wreckage of his life. He saw the sergeant aiming, a cold glint in his eye, and knew that shot would be fatal. A desperate, primal surge of energy coursed through him. He fired, not at the sergeant, but at the rock above him, sending down a cascade of scree and dust, momentarily disrupting their aim. It bought him precious seconds. He glanced towards the crevice where Ilara had disappeared, a silent prayer forming in his mind, a raw, unbidden plea for her survival. More shots rang out, closer now, and he felt a searing blow to his side, a sickening warmth spreading across his ribs. He stumbled, gasping, but forced himself upright, his vision blurring at the edges. The taste of copper filled his mouth. This was it. The end. His past, a tumultuous river of blood and sorrow, rushed over him, every betrayal, every loss, every moment of desperate loneliness. Yet amidst the pain and the approaching darkness, a single clear image persisted. Ilara's small, trusting face, her quiet strength. He wouldn't let them take her. The sergeant advanced, his rifle held high, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Kyle raised his revolver one last time, his hand trembling, but his aim unwavering. The world narrowed to a single point, a singular confrontation against the tide of history, against the overwhelming force of a world that refused to acknowledge his right to exist, or the right of the child he protected. His heart pounded a frantic drum against his ribs, a final defiant rhythm in the face of annihilation. What was a life, if not the sum of what one protected? The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of Cale's own breathing. He lay slumped against the rock, his revolver clutched loosely in his hand, the world a kaleidoscope of pain and fading light. He had done it, or at least he had bought them time. The soldiers, surprised by his desperate stand, had retreated, their numbers thinned, their resolve shaken. They would be back, he knew, but not today, not now. A small, trembling hand touched his face, and Ilara's tear-streaked eyes peered down at him, filled with a raw, unadulterated fear he hadn't seen before. Cale. Her voice was a fragile whisper, a thread connecting him to a world he was rapidly slipping from. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped his lips. He was bleeding, heavily, the warmth seeping into the cold earth beneath him. This was the price of belonging, the cost of protection. He had built a home for her, however temporary, and in doing so had found something akin to a reason to exist. His life, so long defined by solitary survival and bitter vengeance, now held a single, precious light. He reached up, his fingers weakly touching her cheek, a rough, calloused touch that conveyed a lifetime of unspoken affection. He had been a gunslinger, yes, but not for glory nor for wealth. He had been a weapon, honed by injustice, striking out at a world that had taken everything. Yet in saving her, in giving her a sliver of peace, he had found a flicker of his own humanity. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the canyon. Ilara, with a strength that belied her years, pulled at his heavy coat, trying to stem the flow of blood, her small body trembling with effort and terror. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, an ironic calm in the face of his likely end. He had lived a hard life, marked by darkness, but in this final act of desperate protection, he found a fleeting, fragile hope. Perhaps even for a man like him, some form of redemption could exist, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, unwavering love forged in shared hardship. The next days were a blur of pain, fever, and Ilara's quiet, relentless tending. She was a tiny, fierce guardian, applying poultices made from herbs he'd taught her to identify, whispering ancient prayers he barely understood, her hand a constant, comforting presence. He drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the shadows of his past, by the faces of those he had lost, by the violence he had both suffered and inflicted. But always, when he surfaced, it was her small, determined face that anchored him to the living world. Her hope, unwavering and pure, became a fragile anchor against the relentless tide of his own despair. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to mend. The wound, deep and cruel, festered and healed by inches, a testament to her unwavering care and his own stubborn refusal to succumb. The land itself seemed to conspire in their survival, offering shelter and sustenance. The valley, once merely a hiding place, became a true sanctuary, imbued with the spirit of their shared struggle. The incident with the soldiers had left an indelible mark, a fresh scar on his weary soul, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond. Ilara had seen his brutality, his capacity for violence, yet she had also seen his unwavering protection. She didn't fear him. She understood him perhaps more deeply than anyone ever had. He was still a gunslinger, yes, a man of violence, but he was also her protector, her unlikely family. Their dialogue remained sparse, but the unspoken words, the shared glances, the quiet moments of understanding, spoke volumes. They were two lost souls, adrift in a harsh world, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. The sun, now less harsh, cast a golden glow over the valley, painting the rocks in hues of amber and rose. Kyle watched Ilara, her small figure silhouetted against the morning light as she gathered firewood. He was still deeply flawed, still burdened by the shadows of his past, but the darkness was no longer absolute. A sliver of light had found its way in, illuminating a path, however faint, towards a future that held not just survival, but a quiet, grounded hope. This was their home now, forged in blood and quiet devotion, a testament to the unexpected places where love and redemption could bloom. What remained of their lives, however uncertain, would be faced together, a silent pact against an indifferent world.